Just a few days ago, terrorists in Kashmir ambushed a bus carrying Hindu pilgrims. In response, right wing influencers have called for an Israel like solution with full awareness of the ongoing genocide in Palestine. The 20th and 21st centuries have seen horror after horror piled upon the mountainous region, with extremists constantly calling for violence as a solution and using historical evidence to support it. But until we understand Kashmir's deep history, there might be no end to the bloodshed. First, let's try to understand, how did Kashmir become predominantly Muslim? One of our main sources on the region's conversion is Sayyid Ali's Tariq-e-Kashmir. Sayyid Ali was working in the 16th century and he collected documents and legends about various Sufi saints and rishis from about the 1350s onward. To the modern eye living in polarized times, the Tariq contains much that is inflammatory. Kashmiri historian Rattan Hangloo studied the text in this book to understand the reality of medieval conversions. In one of its stories, a Sufi saint, an Iranian immigrant, defeats a Hindu guru in debate. He then orders his disciples to break 120 idols. The last idol miraculously contains a paper with the Islamic declaration of faith, and the Hindu guru immediately converts. In the vicinity of Srinagar and Avantipura, according to Sayyid Ali, temple idols were destroyed by Sufis, idols made of precious metals were melted down. In other cases, temples were converted directly to mosques by removing idols. Now, Ali was writing 200 years after these events, but even before Ali, Kashmiri Brahmin chroniclers also wrote about these Sufi saints who claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad. One of these Brahmin chroniclers, Jonaraja, claims that they, and I quote, descended like locusts, accumulated property, and insisted that Sultan Sikandar should attack temples. The Sultan's councillor Suhabata, who was a Brahmin convert to Islam, persecuted other Kashmiri Brahmins for 4 years, apparently by withholding allowances and imposing fines against the Sultan's orders. Now, there aren't a lot of examples of outright violence against Brahmins, and trust me, I searched for them, but they're described committing suicide in tragic ways, succumbing to dangers as they fled their homes. But how much of this was literary device and how much of this was actual fact? There are many exaggerations in Jonaraja's account. He says, and I quote, "There was no city, no village, no town, no wood where the Turushka or the Turk left the temples of gods unbroken." But in the 16th century, a touring Kashmiri Sultan, Mirza Haidar Duglat, noted over 150 temples active in the valley alone. In only one case does Jonaraja claim that Sobhata tried to destroy the caste of all the people. Elsewhere, he is much more concerned with how, on Sobhata's orders, and I quote, "the low-born man tormented the twice-born, especially Brahmins." Finally, as we've spoken about in an earlier column, Jonaraja himself was a great admirer of his own Muslim patron, Sultan Zainul Abdin, which would not have been the case if Brahmins had been so mercilessly and completely prosecuted. With all that said, there was certainly something going on with sultans, Sufis, and Brahmins in the 14th century. Let's zoom out from Kashmir to understand it. Across Eurasia from the 1200s onwards, nomads from Central Asia had violently conquered older kingdoms. China and Iran were ruled by Mongols, the descendants of Genghis Khan. These conquering nomads had no local support and depended on immigrants to conduct administration. In Mongol-ruled China, the senior-most bureaucrats were Central Asian and Iranian Muslims, while religious leaders were Tibetan Buddhists. In Kashmir, local Brahmins were similarly stripped of their privileged positions and replaced by Iranian Sufis. In the process, the Sufis seized a lot of property for themselves, and they later became a major problem for Kashmir sultans, just as Brahmins had once been for Hindu kings, as we talked about in this video. Greed and bigotry were certainly motivators for idol-destroying Sufis, but as Professor Hangloo points out in Medieval Kashmir, it's important to see how Sufis presented their activities. The Brahmin writer Jonaraja claimed that when idols were destroyed, the world trembled and evils came upon the Sultan. But the Sufi writer Sayyid Ali claims that when Sufi saints destroyed idols, it became clear that they had no magical powers and people converted to Islam. Now, what we're seeing is an elite squabble for power in an emerging state. Both elites, the Sufis and Brahmins, were convinced that they were morally superior. Sufis believed that they were rescuing people, while Brahmins believed that their temples were responsible for the kingdom's prosperity. But there are hints that not all Kashmiri aristocrats thought this way. Many non-Brahmins, according to Jonaraja, and I quote, were ambitious to obtain the favor of the Sultan and converted when it became clear how the winds were blowing. Damaras and Lavanyas, who were mountain chiefs with Hindu credentials that weren't super strong, intermarried with the sultans. Jonaraja actually claims very rudely that the sultan's daughters were life-destroying serpents, but the Lavanyas must have thought otherwise. So much for the ruling classes. What about the people they ruled, the majority of Kashmiris? Jonaraja was an elite writer and he doesn't really have much to say about them except for complaining about how the low-born were oppressing Brahmins, which he clearly didn't like. But were these low-born people hurt and horrified by idol destruction as Brahmins were? Well, Hindu rishis like the popular Lal.The criticized temples as being nothing but stone, so they must have been religious Kashmiris who would not have minded temple destruction that much. Sufi sources present destructions as celebratory events that immediately led to mass conversion, but this also must be an exaggeration. In the medieval period, it simply wasn't possible to force rapid religious change. People had brains and states had limited capacities. Conversions didn't happen instantly, but gradually over the centuries. This is strongly suggested by Kashmir's once eclectic Muslim culture. Professor Mushtaq Kaur of the University of Kashmir writes in this paper that Sufis adopted Hindu religious terms like avatar and deva. Kashmiri Muslims worshipped snake deities for centuries after and continued Buddhist inspired practices like worshipping the relics of Muhammad. And Kashmiri Muslim practices percolated into their neighboring regions. In Xinjiang, for example, ascetics were worshipped like Kashmir's rishis. And finally, the conversion of temples to mosques might not have always been intended to prove the superiority of Islam, but to maintain continuity with the sacred past. For example, the Sufi Shah-e-Hamdan shrine in Srinagar until the 20th century was sacred to Hindus as well, who considered it a temple to Kali. As a tangent, we should note that the brief persecution of Brahmins in the 14th century didn't become a lasting state policy in Kashmir. From the 16th to the 17th century, Kashmiri Pandits were highly literate in Persian and they worked as landed bureaucrats for Mughal governors and Afghan rulers. Professor Hangloo provides a number of examples. Pandit Tota Ram, the deputy of Mirza Yusuf Khan, Pandit Mahadev Kaul, the deputy of Ali Mardan Khan, and Sudarshan Kaul, the deputy of Inayatullah Khan. Kashmiri Pandits also migrated into the Mughal Empire at large. By the 19th century, under the Hindu Dogra dynasty of Kashmir, they were by far the region's most powerful and influential group, as studied by historian Mridu Rai in Hindu Rulers, Muslim Subjects. Kashmir's religious history has long served as a clarion call for India's far right. The standard narrative of its past is of constant, merciless Islamic persecution based on a handful of medieval loudmouths with their own agendas rather than critical, multidisciplinary study. From the far right perspective, both Hindu and Muslim, the story is that the horrors inflicted on Kashmiri Pandits in the 1990s had medieval roots, that the persecution of Kashmir's 14th century Brahmin elite culminated in events over 600 years later. But the reality is far messier. There's no denying that persecutions happened historically, but they had a context. Medieval states violently pitted their elites against each other, and these elites complained about it loudly. But medieval states didn't have the capacity for large-scale persecutions, occupations, and narrative building as modern nation-states do. 4 years of a sultan imposing fines and attacking temples with mixed responses from society at large do not make a genocide. Medieval persecutions pre-gunpowder and pre-telegram could not approach the horrors of 20th century genocides such as the very real exodus of Kashmiri Pandits in the 1990s. The solutions to Kashmir's woes don't lie in the distant past, but in the contested politics of the 20th century. The far right claims that medieval rhetoric justifies modern persecution and occupation, but violence has only ever led to more violence. Claiming that communalism and extremism is an eternal feature of such and such a religion ignores a much more inconvenient fact about us. These are modern problems stemming from modern political failures. It's time we stop using the past as a fig leaf for our own hatreds. I know this might be a controversial opinion, so we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.